In this game, we see Hikaru Nakamura steal a brilliant idea from a blind chess player. Who was that chess player? Well, it was none other than Alexander Morozevich. You're saying, well, he's not blind. He was when he came up with this innovation. It was played against Anand at the Melody Amber tournament, and it is a doozy. Hikaru takes it and makes it his own. A very interesting, entertaining, attacking game. The player with the white pieces is Bartok Macha from Poland, although he now lives in my home state of Texas and is the head coach of one of the top college teams in the United States. Hikaru has black. Let us jump right in. Grandmaster Macha begins with e4, e6, d4, and d5. The French defense, a very fighting opening. Knight to c3, knight to f6, and here Grandmaster Macha plays e5, or the Steinitz system, immediately gaining space, and after f4, we see the outline of the battle. White usually wants to play f4, f5. Black wants to play c5, attacking the base of White's pawn chain. c5, Nakamura does that immediately. Knight to f3 and knight to c6. We continue to see Nakamura pressurizing this d4 pawn. Bishop e3, defending it a third time. And now a6. We see that black is planning to expand on the queen side by playing b5, and if allowed, b4, dislodging this knight from c3. Queen to d2 from white, and b5. Nakamura continues with his plan. a3 is played, designed to help control this b4 square. And this is when the innovation is played, the move that Morozevich played against Anand in a moment of inspiration in a blindfold game. By the way, that game ended up being a draw. And this is a shocking move when you first see it. g5. Immediately attacking this structure, a pawn that can be captured twice. The main move here, by the way, is queen to b6, just continuing to pile on to d4. But g5, and the idea is to distract either the pawn or the knight. White gets to choose which piece they want to move. Taking with the pawn is actually probably the better move, but Grandmaster Bartok, instead, he takes with the knight, which makes sense. You want to keep your pawn structure as intact as possible. But that allows Nakamura to take on d4, and after bishop takes, he gets to take that powerful dark-squared bishop, and now after queen takes, bishop to c5, and notice that this bishop on c5 has no enemy. It basically can maraud along the dark squares, and white does not have a dark-squared bishop to deal with that piece. So that really is a feather in black's cap. The queen goes back to d2, and queen to b6. And look at this position. Just a basic question. Where is white's king going to go? He's not going to castle short. Again, the g1 square is under attack. Castling long is very risky. If he did it right now, then bishop e3 would just pin the queen. He'd lose his queen. And the threat at the moment from black is to play bishop e3, kick the queen away, and win that f4 pawn. The e5 pawn would soon follow. So white is already having to answer tough questions. So he plays knight to d1 to help control the e3 square. Nakamura uses this e3 square throughout the entire game to help control the action. So white's king is stuck in the center. Nakamura's next move also might come as a bit of a surprise. It's f6, immediately seeking exchanges in the center. Usually black will have castled before he plays this move, but he wants to get that center opened as quickly as he possibly can. White's best move probably is just knight to f3 to help defend that pawn, but after pawn takes bishop to b7, we can see black can castle long and get some nice play down the f and the g files. So instead, he takes on f6, knight takes f6. Now, the knight could potentially go into e4 or g4, bishop to d3, and castles. And black's king is definitely safer than white's because white's is stuck in the middle of the board. And he's putting some pressure on this f4 pawn. He's not threatening to capture it, obviously, yet, but the pressure will add up. And knowing this, white plays rook to f1 to help defend not only the pawn, but of course to keep this f2 square under control. But now white will definitely never castle kingside. It will not be legal. Rook to a7, activating this rook. The way Nakamura activates all of his pieces in this game is very instructive. He makes sure every piece is involved in the attack. The knight goes back to f3, and what white would like to do is play b4. If he could just If he had a move here and could play b4, he would knock this bishop off of this diagonal and would be able to fight for equality here. He'd be in okay shape. But Nakamura responds to that threat with knight to g4, increasing his pressure on the f2 square. And if white plays b4 now, then bishop to d6, attacking this pawn twice. And after g3, Nakamura could break with e5. Obviously, white could not allow e4 winning a piece, so he would take knight to e5, knight e5, bishop e5, and here black is just dominating. At the moment, you see, of course, he's threatening to take the rook at a1, a queen to g5 check, then just the bishop goes back to g7, and white is in huge trouble. His king is out in the open, and again, lots of pressure on this diagonal. If rook f8, just king f8, and you can't exchange queens because you lose the rook. So white plays g3 instead of b4, which he wanted to play strategically. Here, black could jump in with knight to e3, but after takes, queen e2, the knight's going into e5, and again, white is okay. So what Nakamura does is he plays e5 first. Again, activating all of his pieces, seeking to open up the f-file, and of course now the bishop at g4 has an open diagonal that it can activate on. And after f5, now he plays knight to e3, and it's a different story. After knight takes e3, bishop takes e3, the queen has to move, obviously. If it goes to e2, obviously the bishop is coming to g4, rook a to f7, and white would be in big trouble if the queen then moved to g2, bishop e4, bishop e2, and queen to h6, with the threat of bishop to h3 skewering the queen and rook, among other threats. I mean, black is totally winning there. So he doesn't go to e2, he goes to g2 right away to avoid that pressure. But rook a to f7, and again, still the bishop is threatening to come to g4. So to stop that, Grandmaster Macha plays g4 to control that square with the queen, and even bishop to f5. The bishops couldn't be exchanged necessarily because there would be a check. So Hikaru steps out of the way. Now bishop to f5 would be a mistake because he could just take and grab the pawn at f5. So here, rook to d1. Now there definitely will be no castling, and we see this king still on its original square, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. Nakamura's next move, very strong, d4. We talked about this importance of this e3 square. This pawn accentuates black's control of the square, but also it opens up this nice long diagonal. The bishop can go to b7 and apply a lot of pressure and pin the knight to the queen. The knight moves to d2 first, but now bishop to f2 check. And white cannot play king to e2 because of queen to h6. Again, the e3 square threatening to hop in there and deliver mate or cause all kinds of mayhem. So basically, white has to give up at least an exchange. So he plays rook takes f2 and rook takes f2. But now white has a dilemma. Where's he going to move his queen? If the queen goes to g1, then queen to h6, again threatening to come into the e3 square, as well as putting pressure on the h2 pawn. If queen to h3, to keep the queen out of h6 and control the e3 square, seems like a solution, but then queen to b7, and he's threatening to come in to the h1 square and cause trouble that way. So because of that, Grandmaster Macha decides to give up his queen for the two rooks. Now, if we look at the material balance, it's not the end of the world for white. In fact, he's got a rook, a knight, and two pawns for a queen. Plenty of material for a queen. The problem is his pieces are not well coordinated, and Nakamura can make a lot of threats to white's king. That's the problem. The two extra pawns soon drop. First, queen to h6. Again, queen to e3, excuse me, as well as putting pressure on the h2 pawn. So the knight goes to f1 to cover those two squares, e3 and h2. Queen to h4 check. If the king goes to g2, then queen to g4 check, attacking the king and the rook, and he loses the rook. So knight to g3 was played. Now, black could take on h2, but instead he plays bishop to g4, winning that pawn and threatening the rook. The rook goes to h1 to cover the h2 pawn. Then queen to g5, again threatening to come back to that e3 square. The knight goes to f1 to cover it. Queen to f4 check, king to e1, and queen takes e5 check. Now those 2 pawns that white had are gone, and it's just a knight and a rook in exchange for the queen, but he still has the lack of coordination and the lack of king safety that hasn't been remedied. King to f2, queen to f4 check, king to e1, queen to c1 check, and we can see Nakamura's next target is this c2 pawn. The king goes to f2, bishop to d1, not only to undermine that pawn, but also he'd love to trade off that light-squared bishop. Getting rid of that bishop would help black's attack significantly. The knight goes to g3 to pin the bishop against the queen. The problem, of course, is Nakamura can just play queen to d2 check, step out of that pin, and then take the pawn. So knight to e2, bishop takes c2, queen takes c2, rook to c1. And after queen to f5 check, white resigned and Nakamura won the game. Let's see a couple of moves, that a reasonable variation that might have ended it. King to e1 responding to the check, d3 hits the knight, knight to g3, but then queen to e6 check, king f2, queen f6 check, attacking the king as well as the pawn on b2. And when the king moves, queen takes b2, and that would be it. Far too many threats. The threat of d2 check, threatening the pawn. And that is probably how the game would have ended otherwise before, but white went ahead and resigned. A brilliant game, a brilliant innovation taken from a blindfold game of Morozevich. Really, really something to see. I hope you enjoyed this game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.